Всем привет, how's everyone doing? So glad to see you once again. Today it's all about tone curves and RGB curves. This is considered to be a Swiss Army knife in any editor's pocket and allows us and replaces a number of different tools that control exposure, contrast, and even color grading your footage. It's also an essential tool in the sense that regardless if you're using something complex like a full-scale Lightroom application on your PC or something like a simple app on your phone, although nowadays all the apps are quite complex with a lot of features packed into it, at minimum you will find the curve stable there. So let's get right into it. Let's see how it works, and we'll be using Lightroom on my computer to see that. Alright, Lightroom is already up and running. Don't mind the picture, I know it looks weird. This is actually a clean plate for a little project that I'm making, a photo composite project. Hopefully I'm going to be uploading it today or tomorrow. Do check it out on my Instagram channel. I will be using this one to demonstrate what a tone curve does. So let's start with the basics. What is a tone curve? Tone curve is essentially a histogram with an added feature which allows us to change the lightness or luminosity and also the color of the different pixels within our image. And this is easily seen in Lightroom. On the top we have our histogram and on our bottom we have our tone curve, and look at the information. It is the same thing but just condensed because it's a smaller screen. And because it is based on a histogram, it works the same way. So our horizontal axis represents our luminosity. So it goes from pure black, which is 0 here, and pure white, which is 255 over here. Our vertical axis represents the amount of pixels in a specific tone area. Same as the histogram, the tone curve is split into different sections. So you have your blacks, your shadows, your mids, your highlights, and your whites. It is exactly the same thing. So what does a tone curve do? It basically allows us to change the exposure, contrast, and the color of our image. Now before we go into detail, let us actually quickly look at the interface itself. So first of all, we have our tone curve with the histogram in the back and also the curve itself, which right now is just a straight line going from pure black to pure white. On the top left corner, we have this little button. What it allows us to do when you press on it is it allows us to create a point on the curve and adjust it by just clicking somewhere on your image and then just dragging upwards and downwards. It is very handy when you want to specifically select a point or an area that you want to adjust. So for instance, if I want to adjust the sweater right here, I can just press and it tells me already where the point will be created in the shadows. I press and I just drag it up and it just makes it brighter. And that's a little too much, but you get the point. Let's reset. On the bottom here we have the channel. This allows us to switch between luminosity, which usually is denominated as a Y, and then we have our red, green, and blue channels. Then we have our point curve. These are, as far as I understand, presets. So we have our linear, which is just a normal straight line. We have a medium contrast and a strong contrast, which just gives you, I guess, a starting point, for instance, but not really important, just we don't need it. We are gonna start from 0 and we're gonna tweak it ourselves. Then we have this button right here. What this one does is it switches the type of tone curve. So right now we are in a curve that's called a point curve, which means that we can draw or actually create points on the curve and then just add it and change it as we want them. Let's reset. If I press this button, it goes into a little different interface. This is called a parametric curve. What it allows us to do is basically change the exposure within certain ranges or regions. These regions are shadows, darks, lights, and highlights. These regions can be adjusted by using these little toggles right here. So you can just define how much of it you want. And then when you actually put your cursor on the line, it gives you these gray areas around. This is basically the ranges where you can change the region. So for instance, the maximum I can go is just on the border of this gray area. That's the limit. And then when you go to your darks, again, you can just go all the way down to the limit and that's it. And now if you don't feel so comfortable using these lines, don't worry, you can just use the sliders, and the sliders work the same way. So you can actually see how the tone curve is moving. And then if you change the tone curve, you can see how the slider is moving. So it's really up to you. Let's go back to our point curve. It's just easier with this one right now. So let us look at the first out of the 4 channels that are available for us. The first one is the RGB, also known as the Y channel. And this one is responsible for the luminosity of our pixels. So here we are looking at exposure and contrast. Exposure is basically the general brightness of our image. So if we are increasing it, we are going to be basically increasing the brightness of all the pixels, like this. And if I'm going to be dragging downwards, we're going to be darkening the whole image. So we can already see the first principle of a tone curve is that by dragging the line upwards, we are adding brightness, and by dropping it down, we are reducing brightness. So let's reset this. Exposure on the hand is a little bit different. I like to consider it as a tailored exposure, in a sense that we can individually tweak the exposure of different regions or areas within your tonal range. So we can create multiple points. So for instance, we can just make a few points like this. And then if I drag this one, and you see how it just changes everything in a very drastic way. I'm sorry about that, but you get the point. Just something like this. But I'll get into a better example right in a second. So if I compare this to a basic slider, for instance, in our basics, we have our exposure and contrast. So for instance, if I'm increasing my exposure, it just overall brightness is increased, right? And then the same thing goes darker. To recreate this in a tonal curve, all I need to do is just make a little dot in the middle and just increase it diagonally upwards. And you see it's the same effect, or downwards. Now when it comes to contrast, if we are increasing contrast, as you can see, our shadows become darker and our brighter areas, the highlights, become brighter. And if we do it the other way around, they kind of merge, becoming more gray. To recreate this in a tone curve, just make 2 points, one in the highlights, one in the shadows, drag the shadows downwards, and then drag your highlights upwards. And you get the same effect. And this is known as a classic S curve. This is our most typical type of curve that you're gonna see and actually use when you're editing your photos, because it's very basic. For instance, when we have an image that is untouched and we have this grayish kind of hue, and I just want to make the colors pop a little bit, all I need to do is just make a little tweak in our highlights and in our shadows. So I'll make a point in our shadows, just drop it a little bit downwards, just like this, just a bit. And then the same thing in our highlights, just rise them a bit. And our image already is much contrasty and nicer. And this is also a good point to mention, that a tone curve is very sensitive. So you need to make very small and delicate changes, because if I just move it a little bit, I mean, you can see how much of an effect it does. It's crazy. So be very, very delicate with it and slowly change the parameters. Now, while I was researching and learning, I came to the conclusion that professionals prefer to use tone curves for their contrast, because it gives them more flexibility and control. And what they would do is they would use the tone curve, adjust the contrast as what they like, then they go in, start editing and color grading as they want, and then come back to their basics and then use the other parameters for a contrast to tweak it even more. FYI, if you don't know this one yet, there's a bunch of ways that you can change the contrast in your image within Lightroom. So we have our tone curve, we have our global contrast slider, we have our texture, clarity, dehaze, and sharpening. Each one of them has to do something with the contrast itself, and they have their own effects. So really just go with the tone curve and then slowly tweak the rest. Now, moving on to our colors. Now, when it comes to the color channels, there's two things that are important to remember. First one is each one of these curves are completely autonomous. So any effect that you're making on one of the four will have nothing to do with the other two. So they are all completely different. And you can see this one. So if I go to my RGB and I just drag it, let's say downwards, if I go to my reds, it's again all the way to 0. So you can really have more flexibility. And the second thing is that dragging our line upwards adds color, and then dragging it downwards reduces color. Now I bet you guys have a question. Alright, so you reduced your reds. Why is all your image so green? And that actually is a very good question, because I was struggling with this. I was not only struggling understanding what is the relationship between changing the reds and why is it green, but also when it comes to actually editing, how do you know or foresee what kind of changes, or how do you need to draw your curve in order to get the colors that you want? And after watching a bunch of tutorials and doing some reading, eventually I figured it out thanks to the good old color wheel. Basically, if you want to learn how to use an RGB curve, just learn the color wheel by heart, because you need to know how the colors are actually made. So for this, I actually have one that's pulled up, and this will make everything much easier. Now, so here we have our color wheel with our reds, greens and blue channels. If you ever been in a arts class, you know that when you mix colors, they actually give you different hues. So if I mix blue with red, it actually gives me a purplish color, so that's actually magenta. If you mix red with green, it gives you yellow. Green with blue gives you cyan, which is why I also mentioned cyan, yellow and magenta color. Now, why is this important? You can look at this in two different ways. For instance, magenta is created by adding blue and red. The other way of looking at the same thing is that magenta is created by subtracting green from the RGB. So if you're subtracting a color from the trinity, you're essentially creating a new color, which should be the opposite of the color you're subtracting, which is the case here with green being opposite of magenta. Same thing with our cyan and red. If we're subtracting red, we're taking away red, we're mixing in more blues and greens and gives us a cyan color, which is the opposite. So cyan, yellow and magenta, also known as CYM or CMY, is the opposite of RGB. Now, the reason why it's important to know all of these three together, because this is how the tone curve works. So as you can see in my image right here, it's quite green, and that's because I reduced my reds, and by reducing my reds, it introduced cyan to my image. Now you might be wondering, okay, Alvin, I get it, I understand you, but you're talking about cyan, yet you have green in your image. And that is true. And the reason why I have green in my image is because of white balance. This is a good example of how white balance affects the colors. So in this case, if I reset it back to normal, you can see that the only thing that it has a pure white is our screen, and then also highlights that are on my face. They are white, while everything else is yellow. So the way it works is that when you have a equal portion of red, blue and green, it gives you a neutral white or black color. Once they are neutral or in the center of this color wheel, they give you each of this hue in their perfect color. But should you have an image with a different hue, then you will have different results because you're mixing in different colors. So in this case, if we are reducing our reds, let's do that once again. If we compare it to a color wheel, when it comes to my highlights, which are white, they start from the middle and we're just shifting everything upwards towards cyan. And therefore, it looks the same color, right? Now, the rest had a yellowish tone. So basically on a color wheel, we're going to be somewhere maybe around here. And as we are moving everything towards cyan, we're going upwards, and therefore it goes into our turquoise, which is right here, which is why it's like this. And to prove the point that it's the white balance, let us actually reset it. I'm going to go to my white balance. Let's select a neutral color here. Let's say this one. Let's say more or less it corrected the white balance. Now, if I actually drag it down, the reds, you have a bluer tone now. And then if I change my temperature even lower, you'll see the cyan way more, even here in the shadows. The same thing applies to other colors. So let's quickly reset this, go to green. So let's drag the greens downwards, just like this. And as you can see, my face has a more magenta feel, whereas everything else has a more raspberry color. And that's because we're moving from yellows all the way to the magenta area, but it's not quite enough, so it's in the raspberries. Now, what if we want to change this to a proper white balance? So let's actually take the selector, choose a neutral color, and there you go. Now our shadows are magenta, but my face is more violet. And that's because to compensate, it basically adds more blue to my face, and therefore it pushes it towards the violet, which is the relationship between reds and blues. So that's how it works. Now you might ask me, okay, so I get it, how it works, but how do we actually get the result or the colors we actually want, which was my main question. And now it actually makes sense, because when you know your color wheel, you know how to get to a specific color. So let's say that this is the white balance that I want, everything's perfect, and all I want to do is I want to change the highlights towards a more magenta feel, a little bit of a pinkish color, right? First question is, how do we get to a magenta color? And the answer is, we need to reduce green. So we go to our green, which is conveniently opened, and let us select our highlights. So in this case, I'm gonna make a point in our highlights, a point in the middle just to avoid the shadows being affected, and let us remove green. As you can see, we added this pinkish hue, magenta hue towards our highlights. However, you see that everything around also became greener, and that is because the curve, no matter how many points you're gonna make, will always move a little bit because it all moves in relationship. So what you need to do is you need to balance the colors. There's two ways you can do this one. The easiest way is basically creating a new point on your shadows and shifting it downwards towards the original line. So let's make a point, let's shift it downwards. And now let's check the before and after, and you see it pretty much is the same, just the color of the highlights changed. The other way to do this is by balancing all three channels. So for instance, since our green changed, to put this back into our normal original state, we need to then adjust our blues and reds in the same manner. So let's remember how the curve looked. Let's go to our blue channel. Let's make 3 points right here, just because I don't want to change the highlights. Let's keep them where they are, mids as well. And let's just add blues in our shadows. I think it should be enough. Let's see compared to the greens. Yeah, that's perfect. Now let's go to our reds and do the same thing. So let's make a point in our highlights, point in our mids, and point in our shadows. Lift up the shadows to the desired effect. And more or less, I think this is enough. So if we go before and after, it still has a little bit of green tone, but again, that's just a matter of just tweaking your settings within the three channels, and it's gonna give you the desired effect. So let's try maybe going to the blues, adding a little bit of blue in there. That's too much. Perhaps actually this is not so much shadows as it is the mids. So if I increase that and then go to our reds, do the same thing, and there you go. We have more or less the same thing. The only difference, of course, is the brightness of it, because we are shifting the colors upwards, so we're also increasing a little bit of the luminance. So then we can just go to our contrast and just bump it up a little bit, just to give us the darker feel, which is exactly what we had before, you see? Which is a good example where I was telling you that when you're tweaking with the colors and the tones, your contrast can change, even though you changed originally your tone curve. So then in the end, you can just tweak a little bit with these global settings just to get it to your perfection, basically. Now let's take it one step further and let's say color our shadows cyan, just for the fun of it. So we know that to make cyan, we need to remove reds. So let's go to our reds and let's remove reds from our shadows, and immediately it's introducing cyan to our image, and it gets a more greener hue. And the reason for that is because greens were increased a little bit when we're adjusting our magentas. So let us actually counter this green by adding more blue, because cyan is achieved by adding a mix of blue and green. So let's go to our blue curve, and let us just increase a little bit more the blues in the shadows. And there you go. Now we have our cyan color in our shadows. Actually, it's a pretty cool effect between these two colors. And this is pretty much how it works. The color wheel really helps to understand this concept, personally for me. And for the next 2-3 weeks, I'm gonna definitely have it side by side when I'm editing my photos, just to get used to it and to memorize it. And I'm sure that we will not even think about it in the future. So we'll immediately know that to get magenta, we remove green, or to get turquoise, we remove reds to go to cyan, and then add a bit of greens to go to turquoise. I'll actually make this color wheel available for download in the description below. Do check it out, download it, use it. It'll help you to understand these concepts. And there we go. I hope you found this video useful, at least as an introduction towards curves. Now this tool has quite a steep learning curve, and I'm sure I have missed out quite a number of tips and editing techniques. So forgive me for that. That's something that I have to learn and master as we go. However, if you know some, do drop a comment with your tips and tricks. This will be beneficial for all of us. As always, thank you for watching. Do drop a like, consider subscribing, and I see you in the next one. Пока!